The scanners shrieked as the alien vessel stumbled across the crumbling remains of humanity's secret fleet, revealing the horrifying truth of mankind's true power. Captain Zorx peered at the apocalyptic wreckage peppering the dead planet's orbit, and an icy fear gripped his three hearts. Twisted hunks of blackened steel and carbonized bone drifted past the Intrepid's view screens, the only epitaph to countless lives snuffed out in a long-ago war of annihilation. The fleet's very existence had been unknown to the Galactic Federation, and this uncharted backwater had never been worth a second glance until now. Zorx dispatched the away team to the surface, swallowing hard, needing answers. If humanity could assemble a force of this magnitude in secret once before, it could happen again, and this time the galaxy might not survive. Captain Zorx stalked onto the bridge of the Intrepid, his claws clicking on the polished deck plates. The data from the away team was already streaming across the main view screen, and Lieutenant Kavok hunched over a holographic display, manipulating it with her tentacles. "What have we found?" Zorx rumbled. "It's unbelievable," Sir Kavok said. She tapped a command and expanded a schematic. Zorx leaned in, his eyes widening as he absorbed the details. The design was unmistakably human in origin: the smooth aerodynamic hull, the oversized fusion engines, but the technology was centuries ahead of anything the Federation had on record for humanity. This fleet predates the formation of the Galactic Federation itself. Kavok explained, awe in her voice. If these readings are correct, this human civilization had achieved interstellar travel long before we thought they'd even discovered electricity. Zorx gripped the edge of the console, his mind racing. How could the humans have kept this hidden? Why had they never revealed themselves? He started sifting through the data himself, desperate for answers. Fragmentary log entries and garbled transmissions painted a chilling picture. The humans had established this secret colony to safeguard their most advanced technology: ships, weapons, things the Federation had never even conceived of. They wanted to keep it out of the wrong hands, but they weren't alone out here. A new image appeared, a nightmare made manifest: bulbous, organic-looking ships, pulsing with sickly bioluminescence, Cryox warships. Zorx felt his blood run cold. Every child grew up hearing horror stories of the Cryox, ruthless conquerors, planet killers, a blight upon the galaxy that had been driven back at great cost centuries ago. And they had found the humans, sought to crush them, to steal their secrets for themselves. The logs took on a frantic tone. The humans were outmatched, but they fought like furies. Sprawling void battles played out in flickering holographics, swarms of Cryox bioships clashing with the silver human fleet. Losses mounted on both sides. The humans pushed back slowly but inexorably. Their colony was burning, but they would not surrender, would not let their technology be taken. Zorx found the final entry. It was tagged with the fleet commander's ID. His face appeared pale and haggard, dark rings under his eyes. "No choice," the human said, his voice distorted by static. "The Cryox cannot be allowed to have what we've built here. This is our only option." He straightened his uniform and faced the camera directly. "To those who find this message, remember us. Remember what we sacrificed to keep the galaxy safe, and know that humanity will never bow to tyranny, even unto our own destruction." The log ended. Zorx stood frozen, staring at the now blank screen. Behind him, the bridge had fallen deathly silent. In the fragmented records, he saw what must have happened next. The human fleet, mortally wounded but defiant to the end, had unleashed an unholy firestorm of self-destruction. Blazing wrecks slammed into the Cryox ships, nuclear fire blossoming in silent space. If the humans could not have this world, no one would. The Cryox invasion force was annihilated, and so the human secret had died with them. Until now. Zorx slowly turned to face his crew, seeing his own shock and disbelief mirrored in their expressions. This changed everything: the history, the balance of power. If the Galactic Federation learned that humanity had possessed this kind of technology and the terrifying resolve to use it, it would shatter the fragile peace they'd built. Paranoia and suspicion would reign, and if the humans ever rose again to reclaim their lost power. Zorx made a decision. "Comms," he barked. "Get me a secure line to Fleet Command now. No one else can know of this, at least until we understand the full implications. The fate of the galaxy itself might depend on our next move." The communication console blinked with an urgent message from the Galactic Federation. Zorx tapped the screen, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. His discovery of the human fleet's ruins had not stayed secret for long. The news had spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of controversy and speculation across the galaxy. "Are they saying it's a hoax?" Lieutenant Kavok asked, peering over Zork's shoulder. Zork shook his head. Worse. They think we fabricated the evidence. Angry messages flooded in from a dozen worlds, each more accusatory than the last. The Zigran claimed Zorks was a warmonger trying to shatter the fragile peace for his own gain. The Quark's delegation demanded an independent investigation, insinuating that the Intrepid's crew had planted the ruins themselves. Zork slammed his fist on the console, the screen flickering. Fools, he growled. Why would we fake something like this? Their scared Kevok said softly. If the humans were capable of this back then, what could they do now? It changes the balance of power. Zorks knew she was right. For generations, the Galactic Federation had maintained an uneasy truce between species that had once been bitter enemies. The revelation of humanity's ancient strength threatened to upend that delicate equilibrium. Fear made people irrational. They lashed out, assigning blame, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. But Zorks had no time for their paranoia. He needed to understand the truth behind the human fleet and their ancient foe, the Cryoks. That name still sent a shiver down his spine. He turned to his science officer, Velix. What do we know about the Cryoks? The lanky Zarian pulled up a series of historical records on his datapad. Not much, Captain. They were a major power in the galaxy centuries ago, but they vanished abruptly. The records from that era are fragmentary at best. Zork studied the flickering images Cryoks warships, their hideous organic hulls pulsing with malevolent energy, hung in space like bloated corpses. Worlds burned beneath their onslaught, whole civilizations swallowed by their relentless advance. What happened to them? Zorks asked. A power that vast doesn't just disappear. Velix shrugged. There are many theories. Some say they were defeated by an unknown adversary. Others believe they retreated to the unexplored reaches of space. Frankly, most people were just glad to see them go. But Zorks wasn't satisfied. The Cryoks and the humans had clashed out here, fighting a desperate war over the fate of the galaxy. He needed to know how that war had ended and what it meant for the present. His musings were interrupted by a chime from the communications console. He glanced at the screen and froze. The message was text only, routed through a dozen encrypted relays, impossible to trace. I have information about the Cryoks and the human fleet. Come to the coordinates below. Come alone. Tell no one. Coordinates followed, leading into a remote, uninhabited system far from the nearest trade routes. Zorks felt a prickle of unease. This could be a trap, some scheme by his enemies to discredit him further. No, but it was also the only lead he had. And he needed answers. For the sake of the Galactic Federation, he had to pursue this, no matter the risk. He took a deep breath and erased the message from the log. Then he turned to his executive officer. Kavak, plot a course for the Zeta Reticuli system and ready my personal shuttle. I'm going on a little trip. Kavak's eyes widened. Captain, is that wise? If something happens to you, then you will take command of the Intrepid and continue the mission, Zork said firmly. The truth about humanity's past is out there, Kavak. I intend to find it. He strode out of the bridge, his mind racing. The lost human fleet, the vanished Cryoks, the shocking revelation of humanity's power, they were all connected somehow, and he would unravel that mystery, even if it cost him everything. Zork's personal shuttle dropped out of warp to the inky void of space, replacing the swirling blue tunnel of the warp conduit. The small craft knifed toward the coordinates he'd been given, a remote, lifeless chunk of rock spinning slowly against the distant starfield. The shuttle settled onto the barren plain with a whine of thrusters. Zork's hand rested on the grip of his sidearm as he strode down the ramp, flanked by two of his most trusted security officers, KRW and Vargos. Their eyes scanned the forbidding landscape, twitchy fingers near weapon triggers. Movement caught Zork's eye. A group of figures emerged from the shadows of a towering rock formation. They were heavily armed, a motley assortment of alien races clad in battered armor bristling with an arsenal of blasters, pulse rifles, and vibroblades. Zork's team tensed, ready for a fight. The leader of the group stepped forward, a grizzled warrior, his craggy face a roadmap of scars and old battles, one eye a cybernetic implant glowing crimson in the gloom. Captain Zorks, the warrior rumbled. I am Rexer. We have much to discuss. Zorks' eyes narrowed. You claim to have information about the Cryoks and the human fleet. Rexer nodded grimly. I do. But first you must understand who we are. We are the Resistance, a guerrilla force who have fought the Cryoks for decades. KRW and Vargos shared a look. The Cryoks were the stuff of legend, nightmare tales to frighten unruly children. but Rexer spoke of them as a clear and present threat. The Cryoks were never defeated, Rexer continued. They merely retreated, hiding in the darkest corners of the galaxy, licking their wounds and plotting their revenge. Zorx felt a chill run down his spine. Revenge against whom? The humans, Rexer said. The Cryoks have never forgotten their humiliation at human hands all those centuries ago. They have vowed to exterminate any remnant of humanity they find. Vargo shifted uneasily. But the human civilization was destroyed. We saw the ruins ourselves. Rexer fixed him with his cybernetic stare. You found one lost colony, destroyed centuries ago. But humanity is like a weed, it spreads, it survives, even in the harshest of conditions. And now, with the discovery of their ancient fleet, the Cryoks will be hunting them with renewed fury. Zorx's mind raced. The implications were staggering. If the Cryoks were still out there and they got their hands on the human technology, they would be unstoppable. We can't let that happen, he whispered. Rexer nodded. They would conquer the galaxy, enslave or exterminate every other species out, starting with yours. KRW gripped his rifle tighter. What do you want from us? Destroy the evidence, Rexer said. Every scrap of data, every artifact. The Cryoks cannot know what you found. Zorx hesitated. It went against every instinct to destroy knowledge, to bury the truth. Rexer sensed his hesitation. He leaned in close, his breath hot on Zorx's face. You have no choice, Captain. If you want your species to survive, if you want any chance of stopping the Cryoks, you must do this. And then you must prepare for war, because they are coming, and they will not stop until the galaxy is theirs. Zorx looked into that cybernetic eye and saw the truth, a truth he had been avoiding, a truth that had been staring him in the face ever since they'd stumbled across that accursed human wreckage. The galaxy was on the brink, and he, Zorx, you might be the only one who could stop it from falling into eternal darkness. He straightened his shoulders, his resolve hardening into durasteel. Very well, he said. We will do as you say. But know this, Rexer, when the time comes, when the Cryoks make their move, we will stand with you. We will fight. Rexer clasped Zorx's arm in a warrior's grip. Then, perhaps there is hope for us all. As Zorx strode back to his shuttle, his mind swirled with plans and contingencies. He had a civilization to protect, a galaxy to save, and somewhere out there, in the cold depths of space, an ancient enemy stirred, hungry for blood and vengeance. The war was coming, and Zorx would be ready. Zorx stepped onto the bridge of the Intrepid, his mind still reeling from Rexer's revelations. The weight of the galaxy seemed to press down on his shoulders as he faced his crew. They looked to him for guidance, for strength, but at that moment, he felt as lost as they were. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the heavy silence. We have a situation, he began, his voice rough with emotion. The Cryoks are back. A ripple of shock and fear passed through the crew. They knew the stories, the legends of the Cryoks' cruelty and power. KRW and Vargos exchanged a grim look, their hands tightening on their weapons. But we have a chance, Zorx continued, his eyes blazing with determination. The humans, they were working on something, a weapon that could stop the Cryoks once and for all. He strode to the central console, his claws tapping out commands. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the schematics they had recovered from the human ruins. The crew gathered around, their faces bathed in the eerie blue glow. There's Zorx said, pointing to a massive structure at the heart of the human colony. An energy cannon, powerful enough to destroy an entire fleet. The humans nearly finished it, but they ran out of time. Lieutenant Kavok leaned in, her tentacles tracing the intricate designs. Can we complete it? She asked, her voice hushed with awe and trepidation. Zorx met her gaze, his own eyes hard with resolve. We have to. It's our only chance. He turned back to the crew, his voice ringing with authority. From this moment forward, we are at war. We must find the components for this weapon and finish what the humans started. And we must do it quickly, before the Cryoks realize what we're doing. Vargos stepped forward, his massive frame tense with anticipation. Where do we start, Captain? Zorx brought up a star map, a scattering of glowing points against the darkness of space. The humans divided the components among several hidden caches to keep them safe. We'll have to find them all. He zoomed in on a particular system, a red giant with a single barren planet orbiting close to its searing heat. Here, he said. The first piece. But it won't be easy. The humans chose their hiding spots well. KRW hefted his rifle, a fierce grin splitting his craggy face. We're ready, Captain. Let's hunt. Zorx nodded, pride swelling in his chest at his crew's bravery. But he knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger. The Cryoks would be searching for the weapon too, and they had centuries of cruelty and cunning to draw upon. He stared at the star map, at the fragile threads of hope and desperation that connected them all. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and it was up to him, to his crew, to tip the scales. "Set course for the red giant," he commanded, his voice ringing through the bridge, "and may the gods have mercy on us all." As the Intrepid leapt into warp, the stars blurring into streaks of light, Zorx felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. The future was uncertain, the odds stacked against them, but he would not yield. He would fight for his crew, for his species, for every living being in the galaxy. And somewhere out there, in the cold depths of space, he knew the Cryoks were waiting, their hungry eyes fixed on the same prize. The race was on, and the winner would determine the fate of all. Zorx stood on the bridge, watching the hellish landscape of the red giant's lone planet grow larger in the viewscreen. The Intrepid shuddered as it descended through the turbulent atmosphere, its shield straining against the searing heat and howling wind. Reading, Zorx barked, his claws digging into the armrests of his command chair. Velix bent over his console, his lanky form tense with concentration. "The surface is mostly molten rock and heavy metals, Captain. Temperature is close to 1,000 degrees, and the atmospheric pressure is crushing." Zorx grimaced. The humans had indeed chosen their hiding spot well. No sane being would venture to this hellish world without good reason. "Any signs of the Cryoks?" Kavok shook her head, her tentacles dancing across her console. "Negative, sir. No energy signatures, no ship traces. We appear to be alone, for now." Zorx thought grimly, but he knew better than to trust appearances. The Cryoks were cunning, they could be hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Bring us in steady as she goes," he ordered, "and ready the lander. We're going down there." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but they obeyed without question. They trusted him, even as he led them into the jaws of hell itself. The lander shook violently as it plunged through the seething atmosphere. Zorx gripped his harness, his eyes locked on the forward viewports. Beside him, KRW checked his rifle for the 100th time, while Vargos muttered a prayer to the war gods of his people. With a bone-jarring thud, the craft touched down on a relatively stable patch of obsidian. The hatch hissed open, revealing a nightmarish landscape of bubbling lava and shattered rock. Zorx unstrapped himself and stood, his sidearm heavy at his hip. "Stay close," he commanded, "and keep your eyes open. We don't know what kind of defenses the humans left behind." They ventured out onto the surface, the searing heat slamming into them like a physical blow. The air was thick with noxious fumes, and the ground trembled beneath their feet, as if the planet itself was trying to shake them off. Zorx consulted the data on his wrist display. "The cache should be 200 meters to the northwest," he said, his voice muffled by his breather mask. "Let's move." They trekked across the hellscape, their boots sinking into the semi-molten rock. Sweat poured down Zorx's face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he pushed on, driven by a determination that burned hotter than any star. Suddenly Vargos held up a hand, his eyes wide behind his visor. "Captain, look." Zorx followed his gaze and felt his heart seize in his chest. There, jutting from the base of a jagged obsidian spire, was a structure that could only be of human design. Its smooth, silver surface gleamed in the lurid light of the lava flows, untouched by the eons. But it was what crouched in front of the structure that made Zorx's blood run cold. A squad of Cryoks warriors, their chitinous armor glistening with unholy energy, their weapons trained on the human cache. Zorx dropped to one knee, bringing his sidearm up in a smooth motion. Beside him, KRW and Vargos did the same, their faces set in grim lines. The Cryoks had found the cache first, and they would not give it up without a fight. "On my mark," Zorx whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "We take them by surprise, hit them hard and fast." His team nodded, ready to follow him into the jaws of death itself. Zorx took a deep breath, the fate of the galaxy resting on his next words. Mark. The Intrepid sliced through the void, its hulking form a mere speck against the vast expanse of space. Within its walls, a sense of urgency permeated the air as Zorx and his crew prepared for their covert mission. The weight of their task hung heavy on their shoulders, the fate of the galaxy resting in their hands. Zorx stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen. The remote planet loomed before them, a desolate world of jagged peaks and barren plains. It was here that the humans had hidden a piece of their ultimate weapon, a power core that could turn the tide against the Cryoks. "Prepare for landing," Zorx commanded, his voice steady despite the tension coiled in his muscles. "And remember, we must be swift and silent. The Cryox could be watching." The crew nodded, their faces set in grim determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. The Intrepid descended through the planet's thin atmosphere, its engines whining with the strain as they approached the coordinates of the human research facility. Zorx felt a sense of unease settle in his gut. The facility was in ruins, smoke billowing from shattered windows, and the walls were scorched with energy weapon fire. The Cryox had been here already, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Zorx gritted his teeth, his hand tightening on his sidearm. "We press on," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "Spread out and search for the power core, but stay alert." The Cryox could still be here. The crew disembarked, their weapons at the ready. They picked their way through the rubble, the acrid stench of burning plastic and metal filling their nostrils. Zorx led the way, his senses heightened, his every nerve on edge. It was Zorrox, the ship's engineer, who found the power core. He called out, his voice thick with excitement. "Captain, over here." Zorx rushed to his side, his heart pounding. There, amidst the debris, was a small, unassuming cylinder. But Zorx knew it was no ordinary object. It thrummed with energy, a faint blue glow emanating from within. "Good work," Zorx said, clapping the engineer on the shoulder. "Let's get this back to the ship," and a scream tore through the air, followed by the sizzle of energy weapons. Zorx whirled around, his sidearm leaping into his hand. A strike force of Cryox warriors had emerged from the shadows, their chitinous armor glinting in the dim light. Zorx and his crew opened fire, the air thick with the whine of blaster bolts. The Cryox returned fire, their weapons spewing bursts of searing energy. Zorrox clutched the power core to his chest, his eyes wide with fear. "Get the core back to the ship," Zorx roared, ducking behind a shattered wall as a barrage of fire stitched the ground around him. "We'll hold them off." Zorrox hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the hard-packed earth. Zorx and the others formed a line, pouring fire into the advancing Cryox. One by one, the Cryox fell, their armor shattered by the relentless onslaught. But more kept coming, an endless tide of insectoid warriors hungry for blood. Zorx heard a cry to his left and saw Vargos go down, a smoking hole in his chest. "Fall back." Zorx commanded, his voice hoarse with desperation. Back to the ship. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs pumping. The Cryox pursued, their chittering cries echoing in their ears. Blaster bolts sizzled past them, scorching the air. As they reached the Intrepid's ramp, Zorx heard a shout behind him. He turned to see Zorrox, the power core clutched in his hands, surrounded by a group of Cryox. The engineer's face was set in a mask of determination. "Go," Zorrox yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'll hold them off." Zorx hesitated, torn between his duty to his crew and his loyalty to his friend. But he knew what had to be done. With a heavy heart, he turned and raced up the ramp, the others close behind him. As the Intrepid lifted off, Zorx watched through the viewscreen as Zorrox made his last stand. The engineer fought like a demon, his blaster spitting fire, his body a blur of motion. But the Cryox were too many. One by one, their energy bolts found their mark, until Zorrox crumpled to the ground, his life's blood staining the earth. Zorx felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kavok, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He saved us," she said softly. "He gave his life so we could escape." Zorx nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "And we will honor that sacrifice," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "We will finish what he started. We will complete the weapon and defeat the Cryox once and for all." As the Intrepid streaked away from the planet, Zorx clenched his fists, his heart heavy with the weight of his vow. Zorrox's sacrifice would not be in vain. They would fight on, no matter the cost. The galaxy depended on it. The Intrepid hummed with tense energy as Zorx strode onto the bridge, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen. The power core, the first piece of the human weapon, was safely stored in the ship's vault, but there was no time to rest. Every moment they delayed, the Cryox grew stronger. "Set course for the Zaran Nebula," Zorx commanded, his voice steady. "Intelligence reports a derelict human ship drifting in its heart. It may contain the weapon's targeting system." Kavok nodded, her tentacles dancing across the navigation console. The Intrepid surged forward, the stars blurring into streaks of light as they approached the swirling clouds of the nebula. A proximity alert blared through the bridge. Zorx's eyes narrowed as a massive shape emerged from the glowing haze, a Cryox battleship, its hull bristling with weapons. "They found us," Vargos growled, his hand hovering over the weapon's control. The Cryox commander's image flickered onto the view screen, his chitinous face twisted in a sneer. "Surrender the weapon component and submit to Cryox rule," he hissed, his mandibles clicking, "or be destroyed." Zorx met the commander's gaze, unflinching. "I will never submit to you," he said, his voice ringing with defiance. "The Galactic Federation will not fall to your tyranny." The Cryox commander's eyes flashed with rage. "Then you will die." The view screen went dark as the battleship's weapons powered up, a sickly green glow emanating from its hull. Zorx turned to his crew, his mind racing. They were outgunned and outmatched, but they had to reach that derelict ship. The fate of the galaxy depended on it. "Ready a spread of decoy torpedoes," he ordered, his voice calm despite the tension coiled in his muscles. "Set them to detonate in sequence, creating a path away from the nebula." Vargos' fingers flew over the weapons console, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Torpedoes ready, Captain." Zorx nodded. "Fire." A volley of torpedoes burst from the Intrepid's launch tubes, streaking towards the Cryox ship. The battleship's point defense lasers flared to life, picking off the torpedoes one by one. But as each torpedo exploded, it left a trail of electromagnetic interference, confusing the battleship's sensors. Now Zorx commanded, "Full power to engines. Take us into the nebula." The Intrepid surged forward, slipping into the swirling clouds of gas and dust. The Cryox ship's weapons fire lanced through the haze, but the Intrepid was already gone, hidden by the nebula's shifting currents. Zorx let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had bought themselves some time, but they weren't safe yet. Scan for the derelict ship, he ordered, his eyes searching the view screen. It should be here somewhere. Minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity. Then Kvox's console pinged. "Found it, Captain. Bearing 274. 50, range 2,000 kilometers." Zorx felt a surge of hope. "Take us in, slow and steady. Prepare a boarding party." As the Intrepid glided towards the derelict vessel, Zorx couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept up his spine. The ship was too quiet, too still. The boarding party assembled in the airlock, their weapons primed. Zorx joined them, his hand resting on his sidearm. The airlock hissed open, revealing the dark, twisted corridors of the human ship. They moved forward cautiously, their lights piercing the gloom. The ship was a tomb, the bodies of its human crew long since turned to dust. But the targeting system was there, a gleaming cylinder amidst the ruins. Zorx reached for it, his fingers closing around the cool metal. And then all hell broke loose. A blast rocked the ship, sending Zorx stumbling. Alarms blared as the Intrepid's comm crackled to life. "Captain, Cryox boarders on decks 4 and 5. They're heading for engineering." Zorx's blood ran cold. The Cryox had found them, and they were after the power core. He turned to his team. "Get this targeting system back to the Intrepid. I'm going to engineering." He sprinted through the corridors, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the sounds of battle, the whine of energy weapons and the screams of the dying. He burst into engineering, his sidearm drawn. The Cryox were everywhere, their chitinous forms swarming over the machinery. The security team fought valiantly, but they were being overwhelmed. Zorx fired, his shots finding their marks. Cryox warriors fell, their ichor splattering the deck. But more kept coming, a relentless tide of death. A Cryox blade sliced through the air, narrowly missing Zorx's head. He spun, firing point blank into the warrior's face. The Cryox crumpled, but another took its place, its mandibles dripping with venom. The battle raged for what felt like hours, a desperate, brutal fight for survival. Zorx's team fought with everything they had, but the Cryox were relentless. Finally, the last Cryox fell, its body twitching on the deck. Zorx stood amidst the carnage, his uniform torn and stained with blood. Around him, his crew lay wounded, some dead. But the power core was safe, and so was the targeting system. Zorx gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening like steel. The Cryox had struck a blow, but they had not broken him. A blast rocked the ship, sending Zorx stumbling. Alarms blared as the Intrepid's comm crackled to life. "Captain, Cryox boarders on decks 4 and 5. They're heading for engineering." Zorx's blood ran cold. The Cryox had found them, and they were after the power core. He turned to his team. "Get this targeting system back to the Intrepid. I'm going to engineering." He sprinted through the corridors, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the sounds of battle, the whine of energy weapons and the screams of the dying. He burst into engineering, his sidearm drawn. The cryoks were everywhere, their chitinous forms swarming over the machinery. His security team fought valiantly, but they were being overwhelmed. Zorks fired, his shots finding their marks. Cryoks warriors fell, their ichor splattering the deck. But more kept coming, a relentless tide of death. A cryok's blade sliced through the air, narrowly missing Zorks' head. They had not broken his crew. They would fight on, they would find the rest of the weapons components, and they would end the cryok's threat once and for all. The galaxy depended on it. The Intrepid hung in space, its hull scarred from the recent battle with the cryoks. Repair crews in EVA suits swarmed over the ship's exterior, welding shut breaches and replacing damaged components. In the ship's medical bay, the wounded lay in rows of beds, tended to by the Intrepid's overworked medical staff. On the bridge, Zork stood hunched over a console, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Suddenly, the communications panel chimed. Zorks tapped the screen and Rexer's face appeared, his expression grim. "Zorks, we've got a problem," Rexer said, his voice tinged with urgency. "The cryoks have located the final component for the energy cannon. It's the firing control module, and it's on a military base deep in their territory." Zorks felt a chill run down his spine. The cryoks were getting closer to completing the weapon too. "How did they find it?" he asked. "We're not sure," Rexer replied. "But we can't let them get their hands on it. I have a plan, but we need your help." Zorks leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on. We need to infiltrate the base and steal the module," Rexer said. "My resistance fighters know the layout, but we don't have the tech to get past their security." "That's where you come in." Zorks considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we're in. What's the plan?" For the next few hours, Zorks and Rexer pored over schematics of the cryok's base, identifying weak points and plotting their infiltration route. They assembled a team of their best fighters and tech experts, each one handpicked for their skills and bravery. As the team prepared for the mission, Zorks felt a growing sense of unease. This was their last chance to stop the cryoks from completing the energy cannon. If they failed, the consequences would be unthinkable. The Intrepid set course for the cryoks base, using a stolen transponder code to slip past their perimeter defenses. As they approached the base, Zorks gathered his team in the hangar bay. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We've got one shot at this. Stick to the plan, watch each other's backs, and we'll get through this." The team nodded, their faces set with determination. They checked their weapons and equipment one last time, then boarded the dropship. As they descended towards the planet's surface, Zorks felt his heart pounding in his chest. The dropship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere, the heat of re-entry casting an eerie orange glow over the cabin. Suddenly, the ship rocked violently as a burst of anti-aircraft fire streaked past the cockpit. "They've spotted us," the pilot shouted, his voice tight with fear. Zorks gripped his restraints as the dropship jinked and weaved, trying to evade the incoming fire. Explosions blossomed around them, the shockwaves buffeting the small craft. Just as it seemed they would be blown out of the sky, the dropship leveled out, skimming low over the planet's surface. "We're approaching the LZ," the pilot called out. The dropship touched down in a cloud of dust, the ramp lowering to reveal the imposing walls of the cryok's base. Zorks and his team charged out, their weapons at the ready. They were immediately met with a hail of blaster fire, the cryok soldiers pouring out of the base to meet them. Zorks took cover behind a rocky outcropping, his rifle spitting bursts of return fire. Beside him, Rexer and his resistance fighters engaged the cryoks head-on, their armor absorbing the worst of the enemy fire. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Inch by bloody inch they pushed forward, the cryoks falling back under the onslaught. Zorks led the charge, his rifle blazing as he cut down one cryoks after another. Finally they reached the base's outer wall. Zorks' tech expert, a wiry Zathian named Xylos, pulled out a hacking device and set to work on the door controls. Precious seconds ticked by as Xylos worked, the sounds of battle raging around them. Just as it seemed the cryoks would overwhelm them, the door hissed open, revealing the darkened interior of the base. Zorks and his team pushed inside, their rifle lights piercing the gloom. They moved quickly, following the route they had memorized from the schematics. Suddenly a blaster bolt sizzled past Zorks' ear, missing him by inches. He spun, his rifle coming up to target a group of cryok soldiers advancing down the corridor. A fierce firefight erupted, blaster bolts ricocheting off the metal walls. Zork's team took cover where they could, returning fire with everything they had. One by one, the cryoks fell, their lifeless bodies slumping to the floor. But the victory was short-lived as more soldiers poured in from adjacent corridors. Zork gritted his teeth, realizing they were being overwhelmed. "Fall back," he shouted, laying down covering fire as his team retreated. They raced through the base, the sound of pursuit close behind. Xylos called out there. "That's the room." Zork looked where he was pointing and saw a heavy blast door, its surface adorned with cryok script. He nodded to Xylos, who set to work on the door controls. The door slid open, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which rested a small, innocuous-looking device. Zork reached out and took the device, feeling its weight in his hand. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, the room shook as an explosion ripped through the base. Alarms blared, the sound deafening in the confined space. "They're trying to bury us," Rexer shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Zork tucked the firing control module into his pack and turned to his team. "We need to get out of here, now." They raced back through the base, dodging falling debris and blaster fire. The walls shook and buckled around them, the whole structure threatening to collapse at any moment. Finally, they burst out into the open air, the dropship waiting for them. They piled on board, the ramp closing behind them as the pilot gunned the engines. As they lifted off, Zork looked back at the base, watching as it crumbled in on itself, burying the cryok soldiers still inside. But even as they made their escape, Zork knew that their victory had come at a heavy cost. Many of Rexer's resistance fighters lay dead or dying, their blood staining the sands of the planet. And as he looked around at his own team, he saw the toll the mission had taken on them. They were battered and bruised, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. But they had the firing control module, and with it, a chance to stop the cryoks once and for all. Zork clutched the device tightly, his resolve hardening like steel. They had paid a heavy price, but the fight was not over yet. The Intrepid set course for the rendezvous point, where they would regroup with the rest of the resistance and plan their final assault against the cryoks. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and Zork knew that he and his crew would stop at nothing to see it through to the end. The Intrepid's engineering deck was a hive of activity as Zork and his crew worked tirelessly to assemble the ancient human energy cannon. Components were strewn across the floor, with crew members hunched over them, tools in hand. The air was thick with the scent of metal and ozone, and the constant whir of machinery filled the space. Zork wiped the sweat from his brow as he locked another piece into place. His hands were steady, but his mind raced with the knowledge that time was running out. The cryoks fleet was coming, and they were the only ones who could stop them. "Captain, we've got incoming reports from the Federation," Kava called out from his console. "The cryoks fleet has been spotted on the outskirts of our space. They're mobilizing for an invasion." Zork felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this day would come, but he had hoped they would have more time. He looked at the energy cannon, still only partially assembled, and made a decision. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady. "We have to take the fight to them. It's the only way to buy the Federation enough time to prepare a defense." The crew exchanged glances, the weight of his words sinking in. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew what was at stake. You heard the Captain Car W barked. "Let's get this cannon finished and show those cryoks what we're made of." The crew redoubled their efforts, working with a renewed sense of urgency. Hours passed in a blur of sweat and determination, until finally, the energy cannon was complete. Zork stood before it, marveling at the fusion of ancient human technology and their own advanced engineering. It was a weapon unlike any the galaxy had ever seen, and it was their last hope. The Intrepid set a course for the heart of the cryoks fleet, the energy cannon humming with power as they approached. Zork could see the enemy ships on the view screen, their hulls bristling with weapons. "This is it," he said, his eyes locked on the screen. "We've only got one shot at this. Kavok, bring us in range. Xylos, power up the cannon." The bridge was silent as the crew carried out his orders, the tension palpable. Zork gripped the arms of his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly the cryok ships opened fire, their weapons tearing through space towards the Intrepid. The ship shuddered under the impact, alarms blaring. Shields holding at 60%, Kavok reported, his fingers flying over the controls. "But they won't last long under this barrage." Zork nodded grimly. "Xylos, target their command ship and fire when ready." Xylos' hand hovered over the cannon controls, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The ship rocked again, sparks flying from overloaded consoles. "Firing now," Xylos shouted, slamming his hand down on the trigger. A blinding beam of energy erupted from the cannon, streaking towards the Cryox command ship. It pierced the vessel's shields like they were paper, tearing through the hull and igniting the ship's reactor. The command ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, debris spinning off into space. The Cryox fleet fell into disarray, their formations breaking as they scrambled to regroup. Zork seized the opportunity, ordering the Intrepid to press the attack. The energy cannon fired again and again, each shot finding its mark with devastating precision. Cryox ships exploded left and right, their crews consumed by the merciless vacuum of space. But the Cryox adapted quickly, focusing their fire on the Intrepid's weakening shields. The ship groaned under the onslaught, hull breaches opening up across multiple decks. Shields failing.